When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 100 U-boats were still at sea. In the days that followed, they surfaced one by one in cold Atlantic waters, their crews exhausted, their diesel fuel running low, their war finally over. What came next was unprecedented. Hundreds of submarines captured, studied, divided among former enemies, and ultimately destroyed. Before we go deeper into how this massive fleet vanished from history, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. This is what happened to the German U-boats after World War II. On May 4, 1945, 3 days before Germany's formal surrender, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued a historic order. The man who had commanded the U-boat fleet throughout the war, now appointed Hitler's successor as head of state, transmitted a simple message across encrypted naval channels. All U-boats are to cease combat operations immediately, surface, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The long war beneath the Atlantic was over. Across the North Atlantic, the Norwegian fjords, and the Bay of Biscay, more than 150 U-boats received the order. Some commanders obeyed without hesitation. Others hesitated, uncertain whether the transmission was genuine or Allied deception. A few refused outright and scuttled their vessels rather than face surrender. Within days, submarines began appearing at designated ports. Loch Arabole, a remote Scottish inlet, received 33 boats between May 8th and May 23rd. Lisa Halley, near Londonderry in Northern Ireland, became a holding area for dozens more. Loch Ryan in Scotland filled with the grey silhouettes of Type 7 and Type 9 boats, their conning towers marked with surrender flags. Portland, England, accepted several boats, as did Allied ports across occupied Europe. Each arrival was carefully documented by Royal Navy and U.S. Navy personnel who boarded the vessels immediately upon docking. The process was tightly controlled. Allied warships escorted the submarines into harbor, guns trained on the decks. British and American boarding parties confiscated code books, encryption machines, charts, weapons, and anything of intelligence value. Engineers inspected the machinery, photographing pressure hulls, diesel engines, periscopes, and torpedo tubes. Many of the boats were barely seaworthy. Months underwater without proper maintenance had left them rusted and unstable. Ballast tanks leaked, engines seized, seals deteriorated. At Loch Arabole, nearly 40 U-boats anchored together in a somber parade of defeat. The logistics were immense. Coordinating the surrender of a fleet scattered across thousands of miles required unprecedented cooperation among the Allies. Some boats had been at sea for weeks without contact, unaware the war had ended. Others were docked in German-occupied ports when the order came. A few never made it to the designated harbors. Mechanical failures, rough weather, or deliberate scuttling claimed them before they could surrender. By mid-June 1945, the count was clear. 156 U-boats had surrendered to Allied forces. An additional 221 had been scuttled by their crews in the final days of the war, sunk in ports from Kiel to Hamburg to prevent capture. The captured German crews endured uncertain fates. Some were immediately interrogated for intelligence, particularly engineers familiar with the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 43 designs. Others were transported to prisoner-of-war camps in Britain, Canada, and the United States. For months they waited in barracks and compounds, uncertain of what would come next. By late 1945, most were repatriated to a defeated, divided Germany. Meanwhile, Allied leaders faced a pressing question: what to do with the world's most advanced submarine fleet? The answer would reveal the opening moves of a new conflict. The United States and Britain recognized immense intelligence value in Germany's revolutionary designs. The Soviet Union, entering the early Cold War, demanded its share of captured technology. The decision came at the Potsdam Conference in August 1945. The three victorious powers agreed to divide the spoils of war. To manage the distribution, they formed the Tripartite Naval Commission, a body charged with determining which submarines would go to which nation and which would be destroyed. By October 1945, the Commission announced its decision. 10 U-boats would be allocated to the United States, 10 to the United Kingdom, 10 to the Soviet Union. The remainder, more than 116 vessels, would be permanently eliminated. The boats selected for study were chosen carefully. Priority went to the Type 21 and Type 20 submarines, the so-called electro-boots that represented the future of undersea warfare. Unlike earlier U-boats, which were essentially surface ships capable of diving, these boats were designed to operate primarily underwater. Streamlined hulls reduced drag. Enlarged battery capacity extended submerged endurance. Snorkel systems allowed diesel engines to run while submerged at periscope depth, eliminating the need to surface for air. Hydraulically reloaded torpedo tubes could fire salvos without surfacing. These innovations made the Type 21 faster underwater than on the surface, a revolutionary inversion of submarine design. The Allies understood immediately that this technology would define post-war naval development. The United States took possession of several advanced boats for examination at naval facilities in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and New London, Connecticut. American submarine officers studied propulsion systems, battery arrangements, and silent running technology. Engineers dissected pressure hulls, measuring steel thickness, weld quality, and structural design. One particularly significant capture was U-234, a long-range cargo submarine seized on May 14, 1945, while en route to Japan. Its cargo included uranium oxide, jet engine components, and technical blueprints, a glimpse into Germany's final desperate efforts to share technology with its Axis partner. After thorough study, U-234 was used in weapons testing and sunk in 1947. Britain similarly examined several boats, integrating them into Royal Navy trials. U-3017, renamed HMS N-41, underwent submerged endurance runs and speed trials before being scrapped in 1949. Other boats served as training platforms for sonar operators and depth charge development. British engineers used real German steel to refine anti-submarine tactics, detonating explosives near captured hulls to study structural failure patterns. Across the Atlantic, Canada took possession of U-190, which had surrendered off Newfoundland. The Royal Canadian Navy used it extensively for torpedo practice and sonar training before finally sinking it in 1947. The Soviet Union acquired some of the most advanced boats and immediately recognized their strategic value. Type 21 submarines became direct templates for the Whiskey-class submarines that would form the backbone of the Soviet undersea fleet in the 1950s. Soviet shipyards dissected German hulls, plate by plate, replicating pressure-resistant architecture, snorkel systems, and battery configurations. The same engineering that once hunted Allied convoys now fueled a new arms race beneath the Arctic ice. To the west, this was a worrying development. The Cold War had begun beneath the waves. Smaller nations also benefited from the redistribution. France, rebuilding its navy after years of occupation, received several boats from Allied stockpiles. U-123, which had once terrorized shipping lanes off the American coast, served under the French flag for several years before decommissioning. Norway operated captured boats for coastal patrol and training exercises. Denmark incorporated German submarine technology into its post-war shipbuilding programs. Yet not every transfer was purely scientific. The redistribution of U-boats became an early symbol of post-war geopolitics. Britain and the United States hoped that sharing technology would maintain balance among the Allies, but as the Soviet Union expanded its fleet, cooperation quickly turned into competition. By the end of the decade, most of the retained submarines had served their purpose and were deliberately sunk or dismantled. Still, their influence proved lasting. The innovations of the Type 21, its battery capacity, hydrodynamics, and underwater speed became the design foundation for nearly every conventional submarine built through the 1950s and beyond. In a sense, Germany's final wartime invention became the blueprint for the nuclear age, but the vast majority of captured U-boats would never serve under any flag. By autumn 1945, harbors from Trondheim to Portsmouth were clogged with captured submarines. Keeping them afloat was costly. Storing them indefinitely was impossible. The Royal Navy therefore approved Operation Deadlight, a plan to tow the captured submarines out into the Atlantic and sink them. Between November 1945 and February 1946, this quiet operation would erase most of Germany's undersea fleet from existence. The logistics were daunting. In total, 156 U-boats had surrendered to the Allies, with 116 designated for destruction under Deadlight. After the Tripartite Naval Commission allocated 30 boats for study, the remaining vessels were concentrated at two primary locations, Loch Ryan in Scotland and Lissahallie in Northern Ireland. From these ports, Royal Navy tugs would tow the submarines into the Atlantic to designated scuttling zones. The Navy divided the operation into three dumping areas, designated XX, Y, and Z, roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles northwest of Ireland. There, the submarines would be sunk either by naval gunfire, explosive charges, or by simply opening their sea valves and flooding the ballast tanks. The first phase began in late November 1945, when Royal Navy tugs started towing groups of submarines from Scottish and Irish ports. But many of the U-boats were in dreadful condition. Some had been at sea for months without maintenance. Others were battered by Allied bombing raids or deliberate sabotage by their own crews. Their ballast tanks leaked, their engines seized. Their hulls were weakened by rust and stress fractures. In stormy winter seas, towing these unstable wrecks proved hazardous. Tow cables snapped. Hulls took on water. Submarines foundered in heavy weather. As a result, more than a third of the U-boats never made it to the scuttling zones. 56 vessels sank on the way, dragged down by rough seas or structural failure. The Royal Navy recorded each loss, but made little effort to recover them. Deadlight's purpose was destruction, not preservation. Once in position, destroyers and frigates finished the job. Crews sometimes used aerial rockets or naval gunfire to ensure the boats went under quickly. In other cases, explosive charges were placed inside the pressure hulls before the boats were towed out. Some were simply opened to the sea, their hatches unsealed, their ballast tanks flooded, and they slipped beneath the waves without ceremony. Among the doomed submarines was U-2336, one of the last boats to sink Allied ships during the war. It surrendered at Lissahallie in June 1945 and was deliberately sunk off Islay in January 1946. Another, U-295, met the same fate on December 17, 1945, after being towed from Loch Ryan. Not all U-boats were destroyed immediately. The most advanced examples, the Type 28 and Type 28 boats, were spared for extended study. British and American engineers examined several of them closely, reverse engineering their technologies for post-war fleets. The U-2511, Germany's only fully operational Type 28 at the war's end, was scuttled last on January 7, 1946, marking the unofficial conclusion of Operation Deadlight. The final boat to sink was U-3514, a Type 28 that went down on February 12, 1946, at 10:04 a.m., officially closing the operation. For decades, the Deadlight wrecks lay forgotten on the seabed. Then, between 2001 and 2003, maritime archaeologist Innes McCartney led expeditions that rediscovered many of them. Using sonar and deep-sea photography, his team identified at least 14 intact U-boat hulls preserved in the cold Atlantic mud. The findings revealed how hastily the scuttlings had been carried out. Many boats sank upright, their decks still armed, their conning towers intact, their steel now encrusted with coral and marine growth. Operation Deadlight had served its purpose, to erase the physical presence of Hitler's U-boat fleet. Yet its aftermath left a vast underwater graveyard stretching across the North Atlantic, silent testimony to the end of Germany's submarine war. While hundreds of U-boats met their end in the Atlantic, a handful escaped destruction and entered a new chapter. These survivors, scattered across Europe and North America, turned from weapons of war into artifacts of remembrance. Among the best known is U-995, a Type 7AC submarine that surrendered in May 1945 at Trondheim, Norway. It later served briefly in the Norwegian Navy before being returned to Germany in 1965. Today, it rests on dry land at La Boe near Kiel, preserved as a museum ship beside the Marine Ehrenmal Memorial. Visitors who step inside its narrow hull experience the oppressive quarters where 45 men once lived, worked, and fought for weeks at a time beneath the Atlantic. The smell of diesel and salt water may be gone, but the claustrophobia remains. In France, several captured U-boats were used in the post-war Navy. U-123, renamed Blason, became one of the few to see regular peacetime service. When retired, it was preserved in Lorient, once one of the Kriegsmarine's main U-boat bases. Other survivors lie in more unusual circumstances. U-534, raised from the Kattegat Strait in 1993, is now displayed in Birkenhead, England, its hull cut into sections to reveal the claustrophobic interior. The decision to slice the submarine open was controversial, but it allows visitors to see bulkheads, crew quarters, torpedo rooms, and control stations in ways no intact boat could provide. Across the Atlantic, the United States preserves one emblematic submarine, U-505, captured intact on June 4, 1944, off the coast of West Africa. The capture was a rare intelligence coup. American destroyers forced the submarine to surface, and a boarding party seized it before the crew could scuttle it. After serving as an intelligence prize during the war, it was eventually transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where it remains today, meticulously restored. It stands as the first enemy warship ever displayed on American soil, a 252-foot-long monument to the Battle of the Atlantic. But the majority of Germany's U-boats never reached museums. The wrecks from Operation Deadlight still line the seabed off northwest Ireland, forming one of the world's largest underwater graveyards. For decades, they were forgotten, marked only by coordinates on Royal Navy charts. Today, they are protected sites, their locations known to divers and maritime archaeologists. Some lie at depths accessible only to technical divers equipped with advanced gear. Others remain beyond reach, resting in darkness hundreds of feet below the surface. Public fascination with the U-boats has only grown. Museums in Hamburg, Kiel, and Le Boe draw thousands each year. Historians continue to study the tactics and lives behind the steel. For veterans and researchers alike, these submarines are more than relics. They are reminders of the human cost beneath the waves. Over 30,000 German submariners never returned home, a casualty rate of 75%, one of the highest of any military service in the war. Countless Allied sailors also perished, torpedoed in the cold Atlantic waters. The machines that once symbolized stealth and precision now stand for loss, innovation, and remembrance. Today, the preserved boats and the wrecks below the Atlantic serve as twin memorials, one above water, one below, telling the final story of Germany's submarine fleet, an empire of steel that now rests in silence between history and the sea. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.